Welcome everyone to our Brigstow Work in Progress seminar today. Some of you may have been with us yesterday when we had a couple of projects that were exploring relations between academics and creative technologies. Today what we're going to focus on is a series of projects that are exploring ideas of environment and activism. And we're going to start with the From Anxiety to Insight team in a moment, who will talk a bit about their project. What we'll do is we'll have a couple of talks and then we'll have time for Q&A. But what we'll do is we'll start off with the From Anxiety to Insight team, and they're going to tell us a little bit more about their project and then some reflections on how things have gone. So maybe I'll ask Lisa just to kick off and to introduce us a little bit, Lisa, just to the kind of project, what the research questions were, what you really wanted to explore and discover as a group.
Sure. Hi, thanks, Tim, and hi to everyone else. Yes, I'm Lisa. I'm a poet and storyteller, and this project is about us trying to find out the current mindset of young people and their thoughts about the climate emergency, and particularly to engage young people from diverse backgrounds, particularly from backgrounds who perhaps they wouldn't ordinarily engage or be having questions around this topic. And we also wanted to understand what they felt they needed in terms of knowledge to be able to cope with the climate emergency and to be able to, think about how they can move forward, and also as well to incorporate art into facilitating learning around the climate emergency. And our initial plan to do that was to create a series of workshops, but alas, everyone knows the current situation, and so things changed.
Great. Joe, maybe I could bring you in, because I know you were going to be essentially involved as well in the workshops, and you're an artist. Could you tell us a little bit more about that aspect, so kind of what the original plans were there?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So, hey, everybody. Hey, the internet. So the kind of initial idea was there was going to be sort of two stages to the project. There were going to be this kind of creative workshop engagement with these groups of young people who we'd identified we'd quite like to work with. And then kind of findings and ideas and questions and just themes that were explored from those workshops would then inform a kind of interactive installation that was going to be taking place throughout the month of April. So that's still, planned to go ahead. We've still been kind of following that structure. But the kind of idea behind the interactive creative engagement side of things was sort of using interactive creativity to help kind of facilitate young people to explore the more kind of emotional side of what is quite a difficult topic to kind of talk about. And it was sort of using this concept of typologies of climate change beliefs, which is an idea from environmental psychology, to kind of provide a framework for young people to be able to explore that in a kind of creative and interactive way. And the idea was to use the sort of themes and ideas from the first kind of workshop stage of the project to inform what would be like certain like provocations that people would be exploring in this interactive event. And the idea behind that was to kind of try and meet young people more at their level, and also provide a kind of opportunity for their ideas to be shared and discussed with a wider group of young people. And it was designed to be a kind of like a sort of private experience, to hopefully allow for more kind of like honesty and kind of expressing and exploring of their feelings. And it's been also designed in a way that we can kind of gather more data from it as well, and hopefully open up more kind of future learning and future engagement with people.
Maybe at this point we could ask you a bit about the COVID context, actually, specifically. I know we're going to ask a question about that later, but it might make sense to ask you a bit about that, because from both of you, what you've talked about is something that, in a sense, and you've hinted at the fact that COVID got in the way in many ways of the original plans. Could you tell us a bit about how that's kind of reframed or reshaped the project?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess in terms of the sort of in the first stage of like workshop planning, we've kind of had to take a view of sort of simplifying that and kind of taking it online we were sort of very conscious that we still wanted to work with the groups of young people that we'd identified at the beginning of the project. But obviously with COVID, that did make things especially hard for the groups that we had identified. I don't know if David and Loz probably have a bit of insight of how the research methodology changed, and me and Lisa can kind of talk about how the sort of creative interactive event has been.
Yeah, certainly. Just in terms of your question there, Tim, about adaptation to COVID, yes, it took a lot. I will say, I sort of promised myself not to harp on about all the difficulties, but that there have been enormous difficulties with this project, one way or another. But I'm really proud to say that they've been overcome. So the workshop ideas on the eve, I think, like the week before the workshops were due to happen, COVID meant that became redundant. So what we moved to after a couple of meetings and input from other members of the team was a virtual focus group event where a small group of young people who were meeting virtually anyway as their youth group, and this was Somali girls, young carers, and the listening partnership, young people with learning disabilities. With our contacts in the youth network, those groups were meeting virtually. So we arranged and proposed that we should have a focus group and use that as the means by which to engender the debate and begin to gather some data. And I'm really pleased to say that we've had initial success with that, and our plans are moving forward. So that's how we've adapted the project. Joe and Lisa could say a little bit more about how the most important element of the project, which is the interactive event, has been in their plans for the redesign of that. But in terms of the COVID, that's what we've managed to sort of get around that or adapt successfully.
Maybe can we take that from Lisa and Joe, and then I'd be really interested to come back to you a bit about what the initial findings that you're getting from those focus groups, because it's such an extraordinary group of individuals that you've been working with and listening to. It'd be really interesting to find out a bit more about the insight. But maybe Lisa or Joe, a bit about your kind of this sort of interactive dimension and how that shifted.
Yeah, sure. So I guess an element of what we were planning to do previously of the event being quite a private experience. That is what's going to carry on. And I think, because the groups that we worked with are quite small, we're able to think about social distancing and that kind of thing. But the whole idea is that in this event, we want to engage the participants' senses. We want to elicit an emotional response from them, and that would be based on the 6 typologies that Joe mentioned earlier. And so these are kind of just 6 categories of emotion when they are placed with an image or some sort of sound. And the idea in response to that from the artistic element is that there's going to be a dancer involved, and they would act almost like a puppet to mirror the responses that the participant is doing, if that makes sense. And as well as that, Joe's musical performance will be live, so that he can respond musically to the emotions that they are choosing and the ways that they are responding. And as well, my pre-recorded poems will be involved in that. So I guess that there's still some things to work out in terms of how COVID, is going to shape this. But in terms of us being able to do this socially distanced, I think it works quite well in that regard.
Yeah, and we were kind of discussing, I remember when we were first thinking about redesigning the installation, because it was going to be an installation that was going to be taking place throughout the whole of April, based at the station that's run by Creative Youth Network in Bristol. And it was going to involve lots of touching. There was going to be this sort of like bespoke musical instrument that was going to be created that would be played, kind of similar to like any kind of keyboard style instrument, I suppose. but it was going to require lots of touching and lots of people using it in a public space. So that was just kind of big no-nos when COVID cropped up. So we kind of talked about different options of whether to try and run something online or keep it, in a physical space. And we decided to carry on using physical space. So it's going to now be a one-off event that takes place. It's going to be hosted by We the Curious.
Maybe could David and Lauren, can we turn back to you a little bit to find out what you've learned so far? As you've done these focus groups with a broad range of diverse young people, what kinds of themes have started to emerge in the way that young people think about climate emergency?
Yeah, we looked at the question that was set, and we sort of interpreted it in two ways in terms of what have we learned as a team. So very briefly, I think we've learned a great deal about coordination, a great deal about persistence, a great deal about working together and generating new ideas. And in terms of what we learned from the research, I would just say that when we re-engineered the data collection, using Myles-Jay Linton, who's a member of the team, his framework, he contributed a recording framework for that. I used that in order to guide the discussion with in the group that we looked at, which was the Listening Partnership Group, to guide that discussion around the 4 questions. So that was really my role. In terms of specifically what the data is showing us, I would say I was really excited by that discussion and what the young people had to say. It was because this was our first. We had this theory, we had this idea, we had this faith in that this would, these voices deserve to be heard, and that they should be heard as a matter of principle, but also that there would be great value from finding out what their perspectives were. And I felt that was all very vindicated. But in terms of the actual, looking at the data and beginning to analyse it, Lauren has sort of put a lot of time into that. So, Lauren, do you want to say, what the data is, what it's beginning to show us?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So obviously, as we've mentioned, there were quite a lot of changes. So had we been meeting the young people in person, we probably would have gone as a team, but it was decided that conducting the research online, it would be a bit overwhelming for them to have too many unfamiliar adults in that space. So that's why we just had David there. But I've had the pleasure of listening to the recording multiple times now. And as David said, it was an exciting conversation, really insightful. We found that the young people had a lot more knowledge and awareness around issues than we might have anticipated. They were quite well informed. So they brought up lots of things around the sort of nature of the problem of the climate crisis, referring to the kind of impacts such as floods, storms, fires, but also things like sort of intergenerational justice around who's caused the problem, which countries might have more responsibility in terms of their emissions. So there's really quite a lot of things that came up there. And then some of the feelings that came out, there was a lot of frustration, concern, general worry, anxiety. But then we also found that they had a lot of really positive ideas about ways to make a difference, and some amazing reflections there again about the fact that, there's not a solution as such. We can't reverse what's happened, but there's ways that we could stop the problem from getting worse. A really nice comment someone made was that as individuals, it's not really worth doing anything, but as a community, if we all work together, we can make a difference, which we found a really nice comment. And they had some ideas about how we might go about making sure people are more informed, putting up posters to remind people of the problem. And also then the other question which was mentioned, we asked them how they would like to learn and the ways in which they would respond well to learning more about the climate crisis. And they had quite a lot of ideas on that as well. They were quite visual learners. They were really interested in learning through short films, videos, possibly games. So that's something that we'll look to take forward and take on board in our next phases of our design for our project.
Great. One thing that strikes me about your projects is you're as you talked about, you're a really big project team. So there's lots of different people involved in the team. And so you, on the online, you didn't want to kind of like bombard a group of young people with like tons and tons of people. But I'm really struck by that way that there's such an incredibly diverse range of skill sets that you all have. So you're coming from quite different sort of disciplines and skills and with different knowledge. And I was wondering a bit about if you could share with us, I don't know what some of the learning has been for you individually, kind of coming, if you think about your own kind of, I guess, position or kind of practice, like how far the project working in this very interdisciplinary way has helped shape or kind of change your own practice or thinking, but also maybe other sort of challenges that you've encountered along the way of working in such a big, diverse team, that represents very different ways of approaching the world, I guess, and thinking about how you undertake research or what knowledge looks like. I don't know who wants to kick off from that, but anyone, I'd be really intrigued to know, what it's like being part of such an incredibly large and diverse project team.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things in terms of learning, in terms of practice, was the importance of coordination and keeping track of what was happening with all the different team members. But I have to say also that there needed to be an acceptance of, with, as you say, those very different skill sets, that they were invaluable. Richard Pancost, somewhere in the background, but always coming in with the wise and scientific and expert opinion. Oscar Berglund bringing in the political dimension. And then, of course, the fantastic personnel at We the Curious, Amanda, who facilitated all the participation. Really, one of the key things in terms of practice is that when you have this diverse group of people working together, that you can put up with any amount of adversity, which might have killed another project, and still win through. And I'm sort of reminded of the old story about the sight impaired people and the elephant, in terms of not so much that there's a single static thing to sort of use the different skills to learn about, but more that this is a dynamic entity around what do these young people think and understand, and how do they want to learn about climate change, but with conceptualizing that as a dynamic thing, the team were able to keep hold of it and keep whatever was happening to actually keep the project developing on those lines. I mean, and some of the other things in terms of the practice, the sort of social learning processes amongst the team itself were absolutely fantastic. And I think we've all learned from that. Social capital growth has developed, certainly on my part, and I know I speak for the team. And there's been an increase in knowledge and basic human capital growth there as well. So all of those things I've learned from, I happen to have learned from the team. I don't know what anyone else wants to say, whether Lauren, you want to jump in on that one.
I could just say very briefly, just from a very personal point of view, kind of what this whole experience has meant for me, because it sort of really brought together all of the things that I'm interested in that felt quite separate, because I'm a teacher. That's what I do. I'm a maths teacher. But I'm also studying for my master's. David's my supervisor for my dissertation, which I'm currently writing up, which is all about environmental activism and research in the youth strike for climate movement, which is why David brought me on board, because it linked together nicely. But just to be able to plan the sessions with Joe and Lisa, which unfortunately didn't go ahead due to COVID, but those initial planning phases, for me as a teacher, to be able to plan with creative people like Joe and Lisa, who've got all this energy and enthusiasm to plan sessions for young people that are going to be educational, but so different from what I'm used to in the classroom at school. It was incredible. So I think, again, we could really bring our different skill sets to that. And it was really an exciting thing to be part of.
Joe, Lisa, I don't know if you got any kind of reflections as well, kind of closing reflection. We'll go to some questions in a minute on being part of this kind of big project that's involved academics, creatives, and of course, critically, young people themselves, the different focus groups. And I wondered what you felt you've learned, individually from being part of a project like this.
Yeah, I'll just say really quickly, I'll just touch up on what David raised earlier on the dynamism of the project and it constantly being a flowing thing and us having to adapt. I think what I'm really looking forward to in this interactive experience that we'll do with We the Curious is to bring forth that idea of we really want to elicit their responses. So we ourselves want to be educated as much as we're kind of bringing information to them. And that was something that we wanted to do in the workshops, but obviously we'll get to do in I think in an even better way with the interactive experience. And I'll be able to take some music and dance images from that experience to create a poem that will go up online sometime on the internet. So looking forward to that.
Great. Joe, anything to add from your own perspective?
I guess like a couple of things. I feel like this is like the first kind of project that I've worked on as a creative that has been like very diverse in the difference of kind of like expertise of everybody. And I think the way that we kind of set the project off from the start was that we never really had, although kind of David's been like the sort of lead researcher, we've all been very kind of fair and collaborative in terms of where we want the project to go. It's never been kind of like, run just by one person and people chip in every now and again. It's been a very collaborative process, which has just been really great. And I think it really makes, I feel like I've just learned a lot about the benefit of just having like a real great diversity of expertise working on something like this. And then personally for my own kind of creative practice, because I'm sort of musician and composer and make sort of interdisciplinary interactive art. I feel like for me, thinking about the kind of potential of research and gathering data and these kind of more academic concepts has been really useful to kind of weave that into my creative work, especially exploring issues around environmentalism and climate change, because kind of gathering data and gathering ideas is really quite crucial to be able to help kind of inform the debate and grow people's awareness. So being kind of mindful of that and having to weave that into some sort of creative event has been really beneficial for me, I think.
Great. Let's just see if there's any questions. We'll take a bit of time for any quick questions. And then what we'll do is we'll move over to the other group and then we'll have time at the end for more general questions. I'll see if there's anything that comes up. But David, is there anything that you have done specifically to enable the thing that Joe just talked about? Like, is it in terms of kind of, I guess, are there sort of ways that you've tried to work that have ensured that this has remained a very kind of, I guess, a project where, as Joe's explained, it feels like people have an equal voice, that you've kind of enabled that sort of, I guess, sharing, so that there is something like Lisa talked about that's kind of dynamic and sort of evolving about this project that kind of feels iterative. Like, are there sort of tips that you could share with us about how to enable those kinds of practices to take place?
Yeah, well, my background is in leadership and management. I've got sort of 30 years as a school teacher and a head teacher and all of that, and teach leadership management basically all the time. So in terms of the first few, going back to theory, let's say, theory around high-performing teams, the initial formation of the team, I mean, there was a great deal of serendipity around this team, really are. But in terms of the first few meetings, setting the culture, setting the tone, allowing people to feel that they're valued, to head off any notions of hierarchical structuring, and to really let people that free-flowing lines of communication and allowing people to take the initiative along the lines of a particular model of distributed leadership was all part of that process. I wouldn't say consciously, but that I felt there was an input there that was developing the team ethos and the team approach. I think it was really interesting what Joe was saying about how that appreciation of research might feed into his creative processes, and equally the other way around in ways in which okay, we've got some findings, we've got some interesting research here, but how could how could it be that intersection with creative events with experiences for people, and then using that experience, which is derived and informed by the data, but is an experience which young people have and is created by people like Joe, but then to use that to then think about, well, what data can we glean from the experience which might then lead on? So certainly that iterative process, Tim, has certainly taken off with the project itself. And I know certainly I've got involved in a couple of small, well, not small, but a small part in a couple of other projects as a result of this. And I know others have as well.
Great. Fabulous. Thanks so much. What we'll do is we'll kind of pause for a moment. We'll chat to the other project team, and then we'll bring you guys back in together at the end, and then we'll have a kind of general wrap-up Q&A and discussion. So see you all in a minute. And what we're going to go over to now is going to move to the I Didn't Buy team. So we've got David, Lisa, Lauren, and Joe departing from the screen. And coming into the screen should be Tim, who's here, and Chris as well. Who have been involved in another project that's thinking a bit about environmental activism and specific around consumption patterns. Tim, maybe I could ask you just to kind of lead off by telling us a little bit about the project. And I know there's other project members who can't be with you, so maybe just introduce a little bit the project team and what you kind of set out to achieve, I guess, what the big research questions were.
Great, thank you, Tim. Yes, yeah, there are several project members who you're not seeing right now who either can't be here or are past project members. So myself and Chris. There is also notably Fiona Spotswood from marketing inside Bristol University, who's done a huge amount of work on this project and can't be here today. There are two other current team members. There's Doug Nelson, who's a PhD intern, and Alison Yoon, who's a programmer, who you're not seeing right now. And in the past, we've had two RAs work on this project. There's Rosie Nelson and Josh Taylor. So we've actually had quite a big team as well, although it's extended over time. And our project stems, I guess, from, I just determined around summer last year to do something about the climate emergency, just on a personal level. And I spent a few days in Brighton, like you do, sort of having some time out to just think about this project and talking to some potential partners there. Nothing ever came of that, but I did have a kind of sort of an idea for some technology that one might introduce into this equation. And so my kind of thinking was, if you think about from Extinction Rebellion to the government, and I could join Extinction Rebellion, I could lobby the government, but it seemed to me that right in the middle of all of that, there are just us as consumers. There's a long history of consumer activism. And the driving idea was, what if we as consumers could bring about change by empowering ourselves, or empowering everybody who wanted to be so empowered, to buy only things that were sustainable. If we didn't buy, hence I didn't buy the name of the project, if we didn't buy things that were unsustainable, then there would be no supply chain towards delivering those products. And commercial entities and organizations would have to change their behaviors in relation to making sustainable things. So that's the kind of driving logic of it. So we set out, this is initially me and Chris and Fiona, we set out to try and understand what people do currently when they are shopping online and they're thinking about sustainability. We asked that question first of all. What do they do? What are they trying to do? What kind of barriers do they encounter? What would they like to do? And ultimately our question is, how can we empower them? Empower them as individuals and collectively, not necessarily either one thing or the other. And then we also wanted to build a prototype. I had the driving idea was, you're online on a web page, you're on Tesco.com doing a weekly shop, which I've since discovered not that many people do as a proportion of all people, not just Tesco's, but just online grocery shopping in general. It's not very many of us. And I wanted, when I'm looking, at the shampoos I could possibly buy, to have an annotation on that web page of which shampoos are more sustainable than others and some information. I wanted to be empowered in that kind of way. In other words, to use the parlance, a web browser extension or plugin, which would overlay on all the shopping sites I ever visited information about sustainability or otherwise of those products. So that's what we set out to do, basically, and those were our research questions. And we wanted to build a prototype of that, which in fact we are currently doing.
Could you tell us a bit about maybe just what you've discovered along the way? Because obviously, I guess one thing you had to try and find out about was about consumer behaviour. And I guess some of that was expected, but I'm sure there were things there that were unexpected that you discovered in that process.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So we did actually manage to run some focus groups before COVID struck. We did actually have 2 simultaneous sessions with people. We're only really talking to people who already have an interest in sustainability. We're not trying to, induct people into this. We're trying to do something for people who already are motivated. And I think probably one of the biggest learnings from that was it's really not just about shopping. It's at least as much about research. And that was the beginning when we were beginning to sense there was a kind of a segmentation of people here. So we did that, and then we went, of course, COVID struck. We were going to hold some more workshops in physical form, but which we couldn't do. Actually, we weren't really blocked very much by COVID. We just went straight online and did these things online. And we interviewed people trying to understand what it was that they did when they did their research, actually, let alone shopping. And we kind of shifted to what people were trying to find out, how they were reacting to the kinds of information that they were being presented with when they browsed on the web. And, again, what the barriers were, what was working for them, what wasn't working for them, what kinds of experiences, were they getting frustrated, those kinds of things. And actually, we got some great online interview data from that, which has all been coded up from bottom up, in terms of what themes emerged. And I would say that we've arrived at a kind of segmentation of people. This is a it's not really terribly the linchpin of what we're doing, but we've got a kind of segmentation of people. There's quite a lot of people who are really tend towards the activist, who actually shop locally typically. They don't want to shop online because there's so many sustainability problems with shopping online. They'd rather go into a physical shop, which they are privileged. They're privileged in a way to be able to do. But they do research online and they do talk online and communicate online about what it is they do. So they try and influence online. You've got your kind of people who are online shoppers by necessity. So, just because I can't afford to buy in physical shops, it's cheaper online, or I live somewhere where there just aren't that many physical shops around. I haven't got anywhere near me to do the groceries, so I just order that. Those people, they're not really online natives. They're online, but they're they're a little bit reluctant about it. And they don't necessarily have this huge understanding of sustainability issues. I mean, which of us do? But there'd be really benefit for some nudges along the way. And then you've got your kind of online natives who just are online. They don't even think necessarily about going to local shops to buy things. And there's a lot of those people who do want to make sustainable choices. But the fact is that information provision is extremely poor. There's loads of greenwashing. It's hard to find even when it's not greenwashing. It's just, and the issues are tremendously complex. All of us are befuddled by, should I go for the road miles or should I go for the palm oil content? How am I going to make that trade-off or whatever it is? It's a really complicated thing. And many people do have like a real drive to get it right. Not everybody does. Some people have a much more vague sense of what sustainability means. But they want to do right. They want to do the right thing. It just needs to be much less frustrating. When they do get it right, it's really satisfying. There is like a real plus in here. People who've really found the thing that's sustainable get a real kick out of being able to do that. So that's the kind of background to there. And there's a kind of, if you like, there's a pyramid of users. At the bottom of this pyramid are people who just want shortcuts to information. They don't want to be searching around without any guidance, just by themselves looking. They want shortcuts to information. Pretty much everybody is in that category at the base of this pyramid. Then there's a kind of layer in between, which is people who, they want all of that, but actually they'd quite like to, when they found something, quite like to tell other people about it. There's a certain amount of influencing they'd like to do. And then you've got the people at the top And they want to do all those things, but actually they're prepared to contribute to that information, right? They would happily type that stuff in and make it available to other people. So you've got this kind of pyramid, and we've got this sort of idea that what we need to do is provide people with shortcuts to information, first of all, but then actually shortcuts to agency, shortcuts to participating. So a shortcut so I can easily compose a tweet about this thing I've just found out. All the way from that to a shortcut to, well, I found actually a way more sustainable version of this thing. I want to give people a link to it, right? Because when they found this other thing, I want it to be part of the statement. And this is like, we've got sort of this idea of making statements alongside products. Things like, I wouldn't buy this because, and then you look at the top 3 reasons why people wouldn't buy it. And then you'd say like, well, I bought this instead. So it'd actually be positive statements about what people bought instead. Or I did buy this because top 3 reasons. Yeah. So really kind of digested, fairly simple-minded. The world of sustainability is massively complicated, but one can nonetheless provide, you're not falsifying anything or oversimplifying things. You're just trying to tell people what other people did.
Could you tell us a bit about the kind of technology of this? I don't know if, Chris, you want to dip in here as well as Tim, like a little bit about how, I know one of the things, you originally started off was to think about how you could use an add-in kind of web browser-based format. Can you tell us a bit more about how that developed? I guess, how do people in those different parts of the pyramid want to receive this information or to kind of convey or pass on this information? Chris,
do you want to make a remark or shall I?
I think it's best if you do at this point.
Yeah. Okay. All right, fine. So basically, it's a Chrome browser extension. Now, this is a problem, actually, because a lot of people shop on mobile devices and you cannot put an extension in a Chrome browser. This is another thing I've discovered as part of all of this, right? But the thing is that we have a lot of understanding now, and I know, Chris, I'm sure you perhaps want to echo this. There's like what we've learned, like as the context for all of this. And then there's like the technological instantiation of a solution to it, and that could take many forms. We happen to have gone for a Chrome browser extension, right? And that but as there are other things you could do. There could be apps on your phone and things like that, which we're not doing. We haven't got time to do. But essentially, it dynamically discovers products in the web. I claim in the web page, any web page, it'll find products in that web page. It will consult as kind of database to see what we know about those products. It'll put up a little button for you to press about that product. And if you do, it'll say stuff like, these are the traffic lights for various issues. It's like amber on supply chain. It's red on human rights, that kind of thing. There'll be some editorial about links to consumer information about this particular product or about the brand that's selling the product. And there are little shortcuts to all those little bits of information that just pop up when you click that button, in a nutshell. There's also the opportunity for you to say, I wouldn't buy this because, or for you to say, I did buy this because.
Yeah. Anything else to add on that, Chris, on the kind of the sort of tech side, or the way in which you feel like technologies can be useful enablers of this kind of activism? Or I guess it's sort of in some ways it feels like it's a sort of reframing of consumers from passive to much more active.
I think so, and I think another thing that Tim's kind of alluded to but not spoke about much more is how it's not about simply buying something, but if you're doing it online, it means it's very easy for you to share the information about what you're doing and why you're doing it with others, including the companies themselves. And that's certainly something that came up, that some, but not all, of the people with more activist stance would be keen on sharing this information directly with the company, rather than thinking about it as, in fact, going back to what one of the people in the previous for the previous project was saying about it being a community thing rather than an individual thing. So seeing shopping rather than as an individual consumerist choice thing, seeing it as part of a potential larger movement for putting pressure on organizations to change, but also building that movement at the same time by sharing the reasons why you're doing things and sharing the research that you've done.
Yeah.
It's kind of, it's a bit of I sometimes think of it as a bit like a Wikipedia of supply chains. Like that data, we need it to make sustainable decisions in our lives. That data should belong to us. It should not be behind a paywall. And we should be capable of creating that data ourselves and harnessing it in a platform that we all share. Part of our commonwealth, in other words.
Yeah.
And I'd like to say something else. I noticed a comment has come up from Caroline in the Q&A, which I think is very relevant at this point. One of the biggest issues is about gathering information. And Caroline alludes to ethical consumer, which is something that I think we might even be using in the prototype, the information from that. But what we want to try to do is have a combination of, if you like, trusted sources, and ethical consumer would be an example of such a trusted source, and user-generated research where individuals will go off and discover something and then share it with the others. And so we're trying to create some kind of combination. And this is something we won't have time to address in this particular project, but at this stage. But one of the important questions around here, of course, is about manipulation. So it's a big issue, as we know, with social media about manipulation. How do you prevent opinion spamming? How do you, or at least spot opinion spamming when it's taking place? So there's various interesting research questions which build on top of where we will be. How you combine expert information with user-generated opinions and information in a way that doesn't allow pressure groups to over-influence, doesn't allow companies to over-influence. Effectively, it tries to create an environment where communities can find ways forward together as a group of individuals and collectively.
Yeah. One thing that's been interesting, I think, about this project is the way that Fiona's been a really central part of this project, and coming from a sort of management background, that her academic research is in management. I wonder if you could reflect on how you feel like that's kind of fed into this, and the kind of things you've learned from working in that intentionally interdisciplinary way that kind of bridges, actually quite a lot of different disciplines within the university and also outside the university, and moves beyond kind of technologies to also some of those kind of insights, I suppose, from critical social science. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's true. I would say this was a very interesting project because the idea originally came from Tim from outside the university. Mm-hmm. And Tim and I didn't know each other, but we actually used to work together at Hewlett-Packard in the same building, but never actually together. So Tim approached me, and I've forgotten. I think I'd come across Fiona briefly and was really interested in what she was doing and thought it'd be lovely to work with her. And so I can't remember exactly what happened, but something came out of that. And it's because we are in different disciplines, but it's very much a complementarity of perspective, I would say, rather than kind of conflicting. Tim is, I would say, more of a software engineer. That's one of the things. So you're broader than that, Tim, but very much, you're interested in making something that works and delivers something in the world that makes a difference. Whereas I suppose I'm interested in that, but I'm interested in the bigger picture and pulling out the research questions. But I'm particularly interested about how technology influences people's behaviour. And Fiona came at it from a social marketing background. So she really brings in information about how people's behaviour are influenced by messaging which affects collective groups. Mm-hmm. And I think those three things came together very nicely. So bringing the kind of, and allowed us to take a broader perspective. And often at times, I would say I wouldn't go as far as to say conflict, but there's been creative disagreements between us about to what extent we try to deliver something that does something right now versus trying to understand the bigger picture. And I actually think that in the end, we've come out with a very good complementary way of doing both.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it resolved itself well. I mean, I would say, I do research, but it's imperative to me that I build things. In this particular case, it's imperative to me personally that I make something, and I have that kind of effect on the world rather than it's just, it's only a paper. I want to actually build something, and we want to continue, by the way. I mean, we want to continue this research and actually find follow-on funding to actually bring this, in my case, fully to fruition. In terms of a tool that people can download and use. So very much complementary. And Fiona's insights into consumer behaviour have been very very important in what we've done.
There's a question that you touched on there, Tim, from Karen in chat about scaling up, the kind of plans to scale up. And maybe could you give us a sense of what the sort of the basic tool you've built is at the moment, the sort of status of that, and then what are the kind of plans potentially to scale up from that?
Well, it's very much a prototype at the moment, and it's just enough to bear. We're about to, in fact, I want to plug our call for participation. Please go to ididn'tbuy.org and sign up to trial our prototype, which we're about to do. Deadline is end of Friday. But we're going to do some online interviews with people sort of trying this prototype out. But it's a bit of a straw man kind of a prototype, to be honest with you. We really want to understand how whether people think we're on the right path at all with this instantiation of the technology.
In terms of scaling up, I think, again, going back to what Caroline was saying, and this is something we have spoken with and even started to speak to some organisations about, scaling up. So first of all, to do the software side of things would be significant, to have something that doesn't just work on Chrome, but works on anything that someone would want to use. And that's going to be important, because if you produce something that isn't usable, it doesn't fit into people's everyday practices, then it's not going to work. But the other thing, which is very much what Caroline was referring to with ethical consumer, we really need to engage with expert organisations who can provide reliable content that underpins this. So we need a combination of user-generated, but we need to have reliable content underneath this if it's going to succeed.
Yeah. And there are paradigms for this. Anybody in the audience who's a programmer will know about a website called stackoverflow.com. If you're a serious programmer, it's the only site you ever go to. The quality is extremely high, and it's not accidentally extremely high. It's extremely high because of mechanisms within it, whereby people who acquire a reputation by being able to contribute and answer questions are able effectively to downvote responses with no real value. And so you actually can create platforms which are self-regulating in that sort of sense. And that's something we will be thinking about when we take this forward. It's just very important that we do that, we do solve those problems.
I'll bring the other team in a minute for more open Q&A, but I was thinking about them because there's a question coming from Caroline about audience kind of market segmentation and consumers, and in particular how far there's things like age are important, because the other team is working very much with young people, with teenagers. Do you feel like there's different attitudes for, say, the teenagers and the grannies, if you kind of think of it as the different spectrums of ages? Have you found that at all?
I didn't see that.
It's overly simplistic to, but there are some tendencies. So it's certainly true that so both groups will do. There are many people who are comfortable online in both groups, but I would say that the retired, I would say, so a bit like XR, Extinction Rebellion, it's very interesting that you've got a lot of 20-year-olds and a lot of retired people and less in the middle who are similar. I would say that to a certain extent that was true of our sampling population. We ended up with students and retired people. And I would say the retired people were more, my character, so this is obviously a generalization and therefore not necessarily reflective of all individuals, but the retired people were more connected with the local community and were, even though they would shop online or research online, were more interested in supporting the local community around them than the students were. That will be my sort of sweeping generalization. Would you agree, Tim?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's from a very small sample, but you definitely saw the 20-year-olds and 50, 60-year-old thing going on with people like with young kids or whatever, just needed to just survive in the middle. You definitely saw that.
Yeah, which, like you said, Chris, is what we see in XR as well, isn't it? This really interesting kind of intergenerational demographic within the XR movement that combines young people and older people, in really interesting ways. What I'll do is maybe let's bring back the other team and we'll kind of go for a bit of time for some Q&A. One thing, Tim and Chris, I really find interesting about your project is I love the kind of negative phrasing, I didn't buy. So that sense in which the act of not buying is a consumer act. And in a sense, I guess you're interested in actually how you enable that an act of resistance to be marked in some way and kind of recognised, which I find really interesting about the way you frame the project.
It's funny. I mean, that was very much, I coined that title because I wanted to be an act of rebellion against corporations that were not sustainable. I'm just not going to buy your stuff then. Yeah. But actually, we've in the interface now, it doesn't say I didn't buy this. It said I wouldn't buy this. Because actually not buying something in a sense is like a weird kind of, what is that? So I've not bought like 1 trillion things today, so.
That's true. You haven't been on Amazon while we've been doing this, purchasing all sorts of stuff to arrive at your doorstep. Yeah. So a nice, an important move from I didn't buy to I wouldn't buy. Are there any questions that you've got for each other? Anything that you'd want to find out of each other's projects? Anything that intrigues you? David?
I was really interested in Tim and Chris's focus on the two polarities in terms of the demographic. And we, as you say, we're very much focused on the younger age group. And it made me wonder two things. First of all, are there other groups out there which, within the paradigm we're working in, that are other voices that we could explore perhaps later on? And the other issue I was interested in, perhaps getting both our team and Tim and Chris's response was, we very much came up against the issue of digital poverty amongst the young people that we were trying to deal with, and so that the online groups was very sporadic in terms of attendance, and we had images of one household sharing an iPhone to claim benefits, do the homework on, and of capacity there. So I was interested in whether that featured in any way in their project.
It kind of, but to a limited extent. I mean, we've really tried to be as inclusive as we possibly could be in recruiting to these. I can't say that I'm satisfied with the extent to which we've succeeded in doing that at all, in fact. But to some extent, we were seeing people who were quite challenged by the need for certain kinds of devices. They've got a phone that works, but their laptop's just died. And they're not someone who could just replace their laptop. And that actually happened at the beginning of an interview. It's just like it was clearly a sort of function of that person's circumstances rather than just bad luck. And I think it's a huge issue. I'm very cognizant that we are typically dealing with certain demographics. However we try and be more inclusive in our cause, it is an issue for us.
Yeah, and I think you allude to quite rightly the wider issue of digital poverty, which COVID has again shown up in the education system in particular. It's going to be, you probably know more about that than me, David, coming from your background. But it is a real issue, and it's interesting that when there are initiatives by politicians, they always talk about connectivity rather than access to devices. And in many ways, it's access to devices, as you allude to, that is more important than connectivity. And I think that something could be done. In fact, in many ways, it's interesting that in many global South countries, that access devices is comparable to what we have here in many ways. At least whether you have access to a device of some sort, not necessarily as sophisticated as we have. But it's interesting that the policies that maybe the kind of pro-tech policies that some countries have adopted to allow it to be rolled out haven't been done. But then the other issue, of course, is training. And I would say that again, or whether people have the expertise and engagement to take on these things. One thing I would say is that it seems to be that teenagers pick it up very quickly. It's a cliche, but it's true. It doesn't seem to be linked to education, class background, etc. There's something about that in the same way that you learn a language, that if tech is chucked at you at a sufficiently early age, that you're going to have the skills that you need. And so that gives me optimism in the longer run, but we do need to find ways to make sure that the kit is given to these people in a way that doesn't give companies undue influence over them. That's what I would say. So
Just there's a question come in for the Anxiety to Insight team. Tim and Chris talked a little bit about their kind of plans to scale up, and it was a similar kind of question for you about do you have plans, or if so, what kind of plans? Like, I guess almost dreams. Would you have of broadening and developing this project once your kind of initial first stage is over? So once you've done the work that Lisa and Joe talked about, this kind of interactive experience, I don't know if you could tell us a little bit about kind of future plans and where you may want to take this and what kind of questions you feel still need to be asked or explored.
It's something we've been discussing. I feel like we're still in the stage that it still feels like we've got a fair bit to do for the project, because so much got derailed. It's something we have kind of had in mind from the beginning, that I think, especially in terms of our partnership with We the Curious, it definitely seems like there's something that is going to provide, that's going to be fruitful in the future. What that specifically might look like, I'm not too sure. I think there's going to be a whole load of learning that will take place from this interactive event. And so I think a large part will be taking whatever that might be and trying not to make assumptions about what that might be at the moment. So it's kind of a case of waiting and seeing what those insights might be and using that to follow on. I mean, it's something that I personally am following on a lot in my practice, and I know that everybody else is, and I know that we do have intentions. Yeah,
I think probably the main one of the main, at least, things that we really want to keep is the relationships that we've built with these two groups, and that will be really valuable to us, and also to We the Curious, that conversation with them continues.
Mm.
Tim, did you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of follow up on that, really, because I'm interested in young people you've spoken to about whether, do you think there's an opportunity of a kind of new kind of network there of young people talking to one another on a bigger scale amongst themselves about this?
Yeah, I think that the event that's planned at the We the Curious, the different groups will participate in that, and that could be used as some sort of platform for developing a wider network. I think the other thing which, in terms of dreams or things that we how we might develop it educationally, given that the young people are acting in a consultative role in terms of learning processes, and they're informing the event. I think, and I know that Amanda at We the Curious, who's the sort of catalyst for these networks and these relationships, is very keen to develop this further. But that in terms of how individuals learn, either in a science museum context or in a school context or an online context, I think we should be able to nurture that relationship and develop greater insights into the ways which best facilitate learning with these particular groups. I think there is pedagogical insights and information and development there that we could absolutely mine and then make available to a wider audience. And there's colleagues in the school who have expertise which we could tap into for. That's been a really interesting idea, actually. Yeah. Just from a research basis, I feel that we can certainly do more research on different groups and deepen the research and gain more from that in different contexts.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question of you guys as well, and this is partly so based on experience that I've had with a lot of different kind of research projects that I've been involved with. But I wanted to mention one briefly, and that is that we're working at the moment with pastoralists in Kenya and Somaliland with regard to provision of climate change information. So it's mainly the Department of Geography, Katerina Mekaliades in geography, and we're supporting her in the same way that. But one thing I would say is that to what extent do we bring our agenda to the people that we go to? So we say, so we do know that the pastoralists are concerned about climate change, but whether they want the particular information that we can give them, whether that's most important, is another matter. And similarly, when you go to the people that you've been working with, the young people, and you say, do you care about climate change? Maybe they say, well, yeah, we do, but there's these other 5 issues which are far more pressing for us. You see, so I was wondering how you kind of engage with that question.
Yeah, Lauren.
Yeah, well, I'll just sort of speak a bit to that. In terms of, I think that has been one of the big difficulties since we've had to adapt. Because had we been going there into their spaces as we'd intended, the whole thing would have started off in a slightly different way, in that first we would be going there offering them an experience, as we plan to do with Joe and Lisa, sort of bringing an interactive experience to them from which we would start drawing some of our research. Now, that doesn't exactly answer the point about the different issues which may be more pressing to them, because ultimately it would still be themed around climate change, but it would start off more with us bringing something and then sort of taking some data in the process, whereas having had to adapt it, it's very much been, okay, here we are with this focus group talking about climate change, very much imposing a structure on them. So that, I suppose that has been quite a struggle. I'm not sure that I have an exact answer. Maybe someone else has some more specific points to add to that. But yeah, of course, we have got a very specific research area about the climate crisis. And as you say, Chris, I mean, they may or may not care, they may have other things. But certainly it's been something we have thought about, how we handle that balance.
I guess that's another really good kind of avenue for future exploration, because I know that it's something that we had specifically designed in these original workshops that me and Lisa were going to be exploring with them, was that it was kind of like, let's start where they are and what are they interested in that isn't necessarily related to climate change, and how can we use that as a way into talking about climate change. I think that's like a really big idea that is not as explored as much as it maybe needs to be. And I feel like I've personally got interested in climate change because I'm particularly interested in nature, but for somebody that is less interested in these kind of subjects which more easily relate to climate change, how do you find your way in, especially when you've got a load of other things on your plate in life. So I think it feels like that's going to be a really healthy thing to be able to delve deeper into in the future. I don't know if you've got something to add to that, David.
Well, just to say that, yeah, Chris, in many ways, we wrestled with this dilemma in the first few weeks and months, very much about how we approach it. And I think in the end, we just decided we would go in with a very open mind at the beginning, making no assumptions whatsoever. That's how we justified it, really. Absolutely no assumptions whatsoever, expecting anything from this is not on our radar, we're not interested in it, we've got, it's all about skateboarding or whatever, nothing at all. With that sort of, but at the same time, we had to take the plunge, we had to actually do something, so we had backup questions. All I will say is that on the initial research activity with one of the groups, the young people's response to the general sort of question about climate change was immediate. It was focused. The emotions were there. The articulation of concerns, so it doesn't really answer your question. So we didn't know beforehand, but we went in with a very open mind. But the response was very positive, which sort of afterwards, in a sense, justifies the research, shall we say. And we certainly were very careful extremely open-minded, open-ended, not to put anything in the questioning or in the prompts that could be seen to be a steer in any particular direction, I suppose.
I'm conscious of time. What I want to do is just finish off with one final question from Anxiety to Insight team. And then I think Joe may have a final question for the I Didn't Buy team. So I'll ask Joe to ask that as well. Just for Anxiety to Insight, a question from Karen. She says, I imagine the mental health and wellbeing sector might be really interested in the outcomes of your project, and also the One City boards within the Bristol City Council at the moment. The question was a simple one. Is there a report report that you could share? Is there a report that you might plan on sharing? So maybe if we just ask that question to you, and then I'll give Joe the last word to ask a question to the I Didn't Buy team. David.
Yeah, they're very much a report, and it's been talked about from the beginning, and it's seemed to be a really important aspect of it, which will then be shared across Bristol. That is the ambition for that, absolutely, yeah. But we've been so focused on keeping the thing on the road and getting it done but it has been a theme. It's an absolute priority.
Great, Joe.
Yeah, I just had a question. It's kind of something I've been grappling with myself, but I think it's kind of particular of interest to the I Didn't Buy team. Is that how do you sort of go about framing sort of positive initiatives to combat some of the issues related to climate change? So, i.e., how do you encourage more sustainable shopping in this instance? How do you go about sort of encouraging these actions which are naturally exclusive to certain groups of people? How do you kind of find that balance of kind of pitching these ideas?
Can I just check? Could you say? So you're right, but I want to know, when you talk about the exclusivity, what particular aspect of the exclusivity?
Yeah, so I suppose in terms of it being exclusive to people who A, already have an interest, B, potentially have the funds to be able to pay for more sustainable products, have the time to be able to do the research, as three examples, I suppose. Because it's it's something I've found personally. It's a positive thing to be encouraging. But then there's that difficulty of like who you might be excluding, and I don't know if that's something.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. My personal view is that the kind systems like the I Didn't Buy system, you could imagine using the experience and expertise of those who are already doing it to make it easier and less exclusive. It will never be fully non-exclusive, but you can imagine using the effectively some of these people like passionate retired people who will do lots of research and come up with the best decision, and also will make trade-offs about costs and sustainability rather than simply going for the expensive and sustainable solution. So I think that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that in the longer term, what's interesting is that, so I to a certain extent don't have a problem with encouraging well-off green people to spend their money in this way, because it drives down prices in the longer term by making it less of a niche thing and more widely. So that has definitely happened with solar panels. Not only, obviously there was government interventions as well, but there's no doubt about it that solar panels are now more widely available, partly because those people who used to spend fortunes on them did that at that time. And so that money was invested in research, which allowed, or rather scaling up, which allowed these things. So I don't have a problem with encouraging people with resources to put their resources to good use. I think that's probably the best way of saying it, rather than spending on holidays in the Algarve or whatever.
Yeah, I feel the same. I mean, we're intrinsically exclusive at the moment because sustainable goods are more expensive than non-sustainable goods. That's the nature of where we are. And I don't mind it being exclusive in these ways that Chris has identified to begin with, as long as it has inclusive dynamics in it to draw more people in, and as long as the economic scale does indeed drive prices down so that we all want these things. I mean, there's really fundamental things, isn't there? I mean, people are buying fast fashion all over the place because it costs nothing. It never used to cost nothing. It only costs nothing because it's made unsustainably by people in sweatshops. Right now, I mean, we want to build around a new economic circumstance in which there aren't people working in sweatshops and everything is made sustainably with regard to human rights, and we need systems and platforms which we can all contribute to and benefit from that will help drive those things. You need politics as well, but I mean, at a consumer level, I think there is significant pressure that we can apply.
Yeah. Actually, I'd like to just follow up on that, because I think fast fashion is a really good example, and cheap fashion. It's very interesting that if you look at the dynamics of what's happening now with Boohoo, etc., that would not have happened 20 years ago. And the reason why it has happened is because of ethical consumerism that took place 20 to 30 years ago. First of all, there was ethical consumer looking right back to people like Tradecraft, etc., who were the pioneers. which made the exclusive segments of the public, for want of a better word, aware of the issues, and then it permeated into the press, and then became embedded through, for example, the Ethical Trading Initiative, which I don't know how many of you know about that, but that would have been put in place about 20 years ago, and that's made a real difference to the lives of people in the global south. From many, it's not perfect, never is, but it's not. That is basic standard brands around the place, Tesco's, M&S, etc. And so that's made a real difference, putting those things in place. And then that in turn means organisations like Boohoo, which have refused to get involved despite being told by the House of Commons Select Committee that they should 2 years ago. And now, if you look at their share price, it's crashed because they didn't take this seriously. And so you can see the rollout. It's not only about ethical consumerism, but you can see the systems change that comes about from what was put in place by organisations like Tradecraft 25 to 30 years ago. And so we've got to take a long perspective. This isn't a short game.
I've got one thing to say to Boohoo, and that's I didn't buy.
Excellent. I think that's the perfect point to stop. Thank you so much. Thanks for both teams for introducing us to two projects. In some ways, kind of asking, I guess, parallel sets of questions, and are interested in a bit about voices, about how do you access the voices of those who are young and often excluded from conversation. Also, how do you access the voices of those who didn't buy or wouldn't buy, and whose voices go unsaid. So thanks so much to both of you. We'll look forward to hearing more about both projects as well as they carry on, and also a little bit more about the kinds of projects that will come from them. Thanks everyone for joining us as well this afternoon, for your questions and comments. And we'll be doing this again, so we've got another one of these coming up very soon, so hope you can join us for our next work in progress next week. Bye now.
Bye everyone, thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Tim. Bye.
Cheers.